You are no man of God.
She whispered, tears in her eyes. The wedding ring hit the floor with a soft clink, just as the first fist struck his face. But what did a pastor do that his wife divorced him? Pastor Richard Coleman was the heart of Fairhaven's church, the voice of God in a town where faith meant everything. Every Sunday, his sermons echoed through the wooden pews, filling his congregation with devotion. He spoke of righteousness, of resisting temptation, of living a life free from sin. He was a husband, a father, a leader, a man people looked up to. But behind the pulpit, behind the hymns and the prayers, Richard Coleman was a liar. There was a woman, a member of his congregation, someone who had once come to him for guidance. She had trusted him, confided in him, bare her soul before him. But Richard saw more than just a lost soul seeking redemption. He saw desire. At first, it was nothing more than harmless touches, stolen glances during confession. Then, the late-night calls, the whispered words of comfort that soon blurred the line between spiritual guidance and something far more dangerous. Until one night, Richard finally gave in to the urges he so often preached against. It started in secret places, cheap motel rooms where their sin could be hidden. Then, the back seat of her car, tucked away in dark corners of town. But Richard grew reckless, too comfortable, too assured that his sins would never come to light. He even brought his affair into the house of God, in the very church where he vowed to serve the Lord, where he blessed marriages and baptized newborns. He let his desire consume him, and that was where he would be caught, the night of the sinful revelation. It was past midnight, when the church doors creaked open. The air inside was still, illuminated only by the soft glow of altar candles. The man who entered hadn't come to pray. He had forgotten something earlier that evening and had returned to retrieve it. As he stepped inside, he heard something, a faint whisper, a hush laugh. His breath caught. Curiosity turned to suspicion as he followed the sound toward the altar. His steps were slow, cautious, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, as he turned the corner, he saw them, Pastor Richard Coleman, the man of God, and the woman who sat in his church every Sunday, hands clasped in prayer. But tonight, she wasn't praying. The sacred altar, the place where sins were confessed, where vows were made, was now defiled by the man who had sworn to uphold its holiness. The man didn't move, didn't speak. Then, slowly, his hand reached into his pocket. With fingers trembling, he hovered over the screen of his phone, and then he pressed record. For a few seconds, all he could hear was a rustling of movement, the whispered words between two sinners who had no idea that their secret was being captured. Then he turned and walked away, the evidence secured in his hands. By next Sunday, the entire town would witness the fall of their beloved pastor. Sunday morning, the bells of Fairhaven Church rang through the crisp air, calling the faithful to prayer. The church was packed, as it always was. Men in pressed suits, women in modest dresses, children clutching their Bibles, all gathered in the house of God, ready to hear the word of their beloved pastor. At the altar stood Pastor Richard Coleman. His robe was immaculate, his posture commanding. His voice, smooth as ever, rolled through the hall as he spoke of righteousness, of resisting temptation, of walking the path of purity. But there was something different today. A few noticed it. The slight stiffness in Richard's stance, the glances he stole toward the crowd, the flicker of unease in his eyes. Perhaps he felt it, the weight of sin pressing against him, the unseen eyes watching, the judgment creeping closer. And then a voice cut through the air, loud, angry, unshaken. I think we all deserve to know the truth. A murmur rippled through the congregation as a man stepped forward from the crowd. All heads turned. Richard's voice faltered for the first time. His heart slammed against his ribs. His wife, seated in the front row, turned to look at the stranger. Confusion creased her brow. What is the meaning of this? Richard's voice held firm, but his hands clenched the edges of the pulpit. The man didn't answer. He only lifted his hand and pointed to the screen behind the pastor. And then the church fell into silence. The screen flickered. A grainy video began to play. At first, there was only the sound of hushed whispers, the rustling of movement. Then the image sharpened, and the entire town bore witness to their holy man, their leader, their shepherd, tangled in sin. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some clutched their rosaries. Others covered their mouths in horror. There, on the very altar where he preached purity, was Richard Coleman, betraying every word he had ever spoken. For a moment, no one moved. Then the first voice rose. How could you? In God's house. Richard spun around, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. You betrayed us all, another shouted. Chaos erupted. People leapt to their feet. Some screamed. Some prayed. Some wept. Richard lifted his hands, his voice shaking now. Please, my brothers and sisters, let me explain. But it was too late. The room had turned against him. His wife's voice cut through the noise, soft, disbelieving. Richard, he turned toward her. She wasn't crying, not yet, but the tremble in her voice held something deeper, a breaking. Tell me it's not true, she whispered. The crowd closed in, their anger swelling. But for Richard, only one thing mattered now. His wife, his son, his family, watching him fall from grace. And as the whispers turned to shouts and the first and book flew toward the altar, Richard knew there would be no forgiveness. The first and book struck Pastor Richard Coleman square in the chest. Then came another, and another. The congregation, the same people who once knelt before him in prayer, who once sought his guidance, had turned into a storm of rage and betrayal. Richard stumbled back, hands raised in a feeble attempt to calm them, to plead for mercy. But mercy had no place here. Wait, please. His voice was drowned out by the chaos. You are no pastor. You are a liar. The words cut deeper than any blow. Hands grabbed at him, yanking him from the pulpit. His robe, the very symbol of his authority, was torn from his body in violent shreds. A frail old woman, Margaret Thompson, a devout believer who had attended his church for decades, stepped forward. Her eyes, usually filled with warmth, now burned with disgust. She spat in his face. Richard barely had time to react before someone else shoved him. He staggered, lost his footing, and then a fist connected with his jaw. Pain exploded through his skull. Then he hit the ground. Boots, heels, fists, they all came down on him. His ribs cracked under the weight of a heavy kick. His back screamed in agony as blows landed again and again. Someone grabbed his hair, jerked his head up just to slap him across the face. You stood at this altar and lied to us. The weight of their betrayal fueled their anger. Richard gasped for air, coughing on his own blood. His vision blurred. Faces twisted with fury loomed over him. Men, women, even those he had baptized with his own hands. Someone yanked him up just to shove him back down. His head hit the cold marble floor of the church. A sharp ringing filled his ears. He reached out blindly, fingers clawing at the ground, at anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. This was his judgment. This was his punishment. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard his wife's shattered sobs. She had defended him for so long, had trusted him, had stood by his side when people whispered about him. Now, she could only watch him fall. Then sirens, a sharp wail, piercing through the madness. Police officers burst through the doors, their voices commanding, authoritative. Step back. Everyone stepped back. The crowd hesitated, the spell of fury breaking. Some backed away, ashamed of what they had done. Others lingered, their hands still curled into fists, their breath ragged from the violence. 2 officers pushed through the sea of people and knelt beside Richard. He felt hands gripping his arms, lifting him from the floor. His body sagged, too weak to resist. His vision swam, but he could still see the faces, staring at him, judging him. The man who had once commanded the room now hung limp in the grasp of law enforcement, beaten and disgraced. Blood dripped from his nose, his lips. His robes were in tatters. And as they carried him away, Richard Coleman realized something. He was no longer a pastor, no longer a leader. He was just a man, a fallen man who had lost everything. The town of Brookhaven was no stranger to scandal, but never had it faced something like this. By the time Pastor Richard Coleman opened his swollen eyes in a hospital, his name had already become a curse in the mouths of those who once praised him. News cameras swarmed outside the hospital, their voices echoing through televisions across the country. Pastor Richard Coleman, once a beloved figure, now disgraced after shocking revelations of infidelity. Coleman's betrayal has left the town of Brookhaven in a state of disbelief. Community members demand justice after their faith was exploited. His face was everywhere. His sins, once hidden behind whispered prayers and closed doors, were now public knowledge. But while Richard lay in a hospital bed, nursing broken ribs and a bruised ego, his church gathered again, not for a sermon, not for forgiveness, for answers. The church was full, but it no longer felt like a house of God. There were no hymns, no prayers, only whispers of betrayal. At the altar stood Elder James Whitmore, one of the church's oldest and most respected leaders. His face, usually calm and wise, was now grim and tired. He let the silence sit for a moment, the weight of it pressing down on the congregation. Then he spoke. Pastor Richard Coleman betrayed not just his family, but this entire community. The words hung heavy in the air. He used his position for sin. He twisted faith into something vile. He made a mockery of the trust we placed in him. Some in the crowd bowed their heads in shame, as if they had been complicit in his deception. Others sat still, faces frozen in disbelief, as if hoping that somehow this was all just a terrible mistake. Then Elder Whitmore's voice hardened. If anyone else has something to say, now is the time. The silence was suffocating, until a voice broke through, soft, trembling, but clear. I have something to say. Every head turned. At the back of the room stood a girl, young, barely 18. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her lower lip quivered, but she refused to look away. Her eyes met Elder Whitmore's, then flickered the empty pulpit where Richard once stood. Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to speak. I was with him too. The church fell into stunned silence. A second blow, just as devastating as the first. Gasps rippled through the pews. Some clutched their chests, others shook their heads in denial. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she continued, "He told me it was God's will. He told me it was special." Her voice cracked. I believed him. And then a cry from the crowd. A woman shot up from her seat, her face pale, her body shaking. The same woman from the video. The woman Richard had been caught with. She stared at the girl, her daughter, in horror. "No, not you," a broken whisper. A mother's worst nightmare. The truth crashed over the church like a wave. Pastor Richard Coleman hadn't just betrayed his wife, hadn't just betrayed his people. He had been with the mother and the daughter. Together, the whispers turned to shouts. Someone stood up too fast, knocking over a Bible. It hit the floor with a hollow thud. The air was thick with disgust, rage, and something even darker, realization. They had let this man guide their children. They had trusted him, and he had used that trust to satisfy his own desires. A woman clutched her rosary so tightly that the beads snapped, spilling onto the floor. A man stormed out, unable to hear more, and at the front of the church, Elder Whitmore closed his eyes, gripping the edges of the pulpit as if steadying himself. He knew what had to happen next. The church had prayed for salvation. Instead, they had been led by the devil himself. Richard Coleman had betrayed his church. He had corrupted a mother and her daughter. He had lied, manipulated, and disgraced the very people who had trusted him. But his greatest betrayal had yet to be addressed. His wife. For the entire night, Margaret Coleman had sat silent, through the revelation, through the scandal. through the humiliation of watching her husband's sins exposed before an entire congregation. She had been the perfect wife, devoted, faithful, loyal. She had defended him. When people whispered doubts about Richard's character, she silenced them. When he came home late, smelling of unfamiliar perfume, she looked the other way. When their marriage grew cold, distant, she told herself it was just stress, exhaustion, God's test. But this was unforgivable. And now, as the church sat in stunned silence, Margaret finally rose to her feet. The crowd parted for her as she stepped forward. She walked slowly, deliberately, not with sadness, but with purpose. At the front of the church, Richard stood, still bandaged and weak from the beating he had received the night before. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, his lips cracked and bruised. His pride was shattered, his reputation in ruins. But Margaret didn't see a broken man. She saw a monster. Without a word, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The crack echoed through the church. Gasps followed. Richard staggered, caught off guard, not by the force of the slap, but by the look in her eyes. Pure rage, pure disgust. She leaned in close, voice trembling, but not weak. "You let me defend you." Her words dripped with betrayal. "You let me believe in you." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she wiped it away with fury, not sorrow. And all this time, her breath hitched, but she forced herself to say it. "You were the devil in disguise." Richard didn't speak. There was nothing he could say. Margaret's hand shook, but she didn't hesitate. She removed her wedding ring. The symbol of the life they built, the vows they exchanged, the love she once believed in, she threw it at his feet. It clattered against the cold church floor. "I want a divorce," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Whispers spread like wildfire. Margaret wasn't finished. She lifted her chin, voice steady and unbreakable. "And I'm taking our son far away from this disgrace." The words were a death sentence. Richard flinched, as if finally realizing the weight of what he had done. His wife, his child, his family, gone. Everything he had once held above all else, his reputation, his power, his control, destroyed. The church erupted into murmurs. Some women wept, feeling Margaret's pain. Some men shook their heads, disgusted by Richard's fall from grace. But Richard, he didn't fight it. He didn't beg. He had no words left. He simply stood there, watching as the only person who had ever truly loved him walked away. Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. She was free. And Richard Coleman was nothing. The town had been betrayed. Faith had been shattered. The people who had once hung on to Richard's every word now stood divided. Some still struggled to accept the truth, refusing to believe that the man who had led them in prayer was nothing more than a fraud. Others demanded justice, furious that they had followed a lie. There were those who still clutched their rosaries, whispering prayers that this was all some terrible mistake. But the truth had already been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The church leaders gathered in the very hall where Richard once commanded respect. Now, his name was spoken with disdain. Their decision was swift, final, unforgiving. Richard Coleman was stripped of his position. He would never stand at the altar again. He would never be called Pastor Richard again. His name was erased from church records. His sermons were discarded, burned, forgotten. Every trace of his once glorified presence was wiped away. He was not just cast out, he was unmade. A man who had once stood above all, now reduced to nothing. In the days that followed, the town tried to move forward, but the scars remained. The church still stood tall, its stained glass windows reflecting the morning sun as they always had. But inside, the air felt different, heavier, colder. Faith had been tested. Some left the church forever, unable to worship in the same place where Richard had committed his sins. Others stayed, determined to rebuild what had been broken. But no matter how much they prayed, how much they tried to restore what had been lost, the town would never be the same again. Richard Coleman walked out of the hospital with nothing left but the burden of his sins. His face was bruised, his body weak, but the heaviest wounds were the ones no doctor could heal. The wounds of humiliation, of disgrace, of knowing he had destroyed everything. As he stepped onto the streets, people stared. Some whispered behind cupped hands. Some turned away in disgust. A few, bolder than the rest, spat the ground near his feet, their contempt unhidden. The man who had once been greeted with smiles and respect was now met with cold, unforgiving silence. He had been their shepherd, and he had led them into darkness. And as he walked past a town that once loved him, he realized he would never be forgiven, not by his wife, not by his church, not by his God. Richard Coleman had fallen from grace, and he would never rise again.